Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, hello everybody. I'm Neil Shusterman, and I'm here to talk to you today about reading and writing and everything that goes with it. Now, the way that I like to do this is rather than standing up here and giving you a big long lecture about all the things that I want to talk about, I want to hear the things that you'd like to talk about. So I'd like to open it up right away to questions, and we'll make this a conversation between me and you rather than just a presentation. Now, I know that you guys have been reading the books. We can talk about the books. We can talk about writing for film and for TV, which I also do. We can talk about the writing process and what it's like being a writer. I am fascinated by existence, by the concept of the soul, and this is something that is always kind of coming back in the story, in my stories. You know, the idea in Everlost of what happens, you know, if you're caught between life and death, and the idea of creating this reality, this alternate reality, has always been a fascination of mine in terms of, you know, just coming up with other worlds that we haven't seen before. You know, there's a lot of different conventions for stories. You know, you think of fantasy. Tolkien, he sort of set up the basic rules for what you call high fantasy. You know, swords and sorcery and all of that. And so those are kind of rules that you accept, and a lot of other stories are based around a lot of those same rules. The hard thing to do is to come up with a world that isn't based on somebody else's rules. When I set out to write Everlost, I wanted to do that. I wanted to create a world that had its own rules and to really world build it from scratch. You know, it's a ghost story, but I did not want to take anything traditional from ghost stories. I sort of wanted to take ghost stories and turn it on its ear and come up with a new kind of reality. Quite a challenge to do that. And what I found was when I started it, the world just kept growing and growing and growing until I realized I couldn't tell the whole story in a single book. So it ended up becoming 3 books. But whether or not my stories are focused on existentialism, I would say that a lot of them are really focused on philosophy in general. I mean, I try to look at the world from as many different points of view, look at human existence from as many points of view as possible. And some really good arenas for being able to do that are fantasy and science fiction. You know, I mean, you could take a look at our world, but if you look at it through, say, a dystopian story like Unwind that takes place in a dark future, it sort of reflects on the problems of today and how our society might end up twisting into a place like that if it goes in a wrong direction. And so it's kind of like, you know, looking at our world through fantasy and science fiction is like taking a magnifying glass and sort of looking at the problems, looking at the things that aren't working right and blowing it out of proportion so we can sort of really look at them in a different perspective. Would Everlost be a reverse ghost story? It's kind of like an anti-ghost story. It challenges a lot of the conventions of ghost stories. For instance, in ghost stories, one of the traditional things that always happens is our ghosts walk through walls, right? We see that in the movies all the time. That always annoyed me, because if a ghost can walk through walls, why don't they sink through the floor? You know, I mean, if they're walking, they're experiencing gravity, right? And the floor is just a wall beneath your feet. Logically, they ought to just get sucked right through the floor and down to the center of the earth. So I said, okay, in my ghost story, I'm going to deal with sort of like the real world issues of ghost stories. You know, I try to make it, even though I'm creating this unreal environment, I'm trying to make it obey the rules of the real world. And so that was kind of a challenge. So yeah, it kind of is an anti-ghost story. How did I come up with the plot of Unwind? Unwind came from 3 different places that were totally unrelated. The first inkling for the idea came from an article that I read. And the headline is what caught my attention. Why is England afraid of their teenagers? In this article, it was talking about this social situation that's going on in England. There have been teenagers, they get out of school and they can't get work, or they drop out of school, and they have been basically just hanging out in their neighborhoods, getting more and more violent, more and more angry, to the point that they're terrorizing these neighborhoods. People are afraid to go out of their homes because of their neighborhood teens. And it's kind of a scary situation, because it's like all over the society. In every town and every city, there are these feral teens, they call them, and it's become a real problem. What was most disturbing to me about the article was what the adults were saying, who were frustrated in this situation. They interviewed these people, and they said, people were saying things like, you know, we just ought to round them all up and put them out of their misery. You know, what are they good for? And I thought about that, and I thought, wow, how bad does a social situation have to get until you're actually willing to do away with your angry violent, disenfranchised teens. I mean, were they just saying that out of frustration, or did they really mean it? And at what point does saying it cross over into actually doing it? So that was kind of sitting in the back of my mind. Then, unrelated, I had seen an article, or excuse me, this had been actually a news report on voting patterns in the United States. There was a team of researchers that they were trying to understand the sociological reasons why Americans voted for the candidates that they voted for. You know, what was really at the basis for their choice of who they were electing? This particular year was midterm elections, like this past year. Congressmen, senators, governors, and mayors, and they were asking people about their candidates and why they were voting for their candidates. People said what you might expect. Well, this candidate's in my political party, and I always vote for my party. Or they would say things like, well, this candidate believes what I believe on health care, or the economy, or the war in Iraq. Whatever the issues were, they would all talk about it, and this is why they were voting for their candidates. Then they asked them about the issue of abortion. The moment that word was mentioned, regardless of whether the person was pro-life or pro-choice, they got very serious. And you could tell there was a strong gut, emotional reaction to this issue that none of the other issues had. So the researchers found this really curious, that this one issue seemed to have this emotional response. So they asked everybody the same question. If your candidate were to flip-flop on a single issue and came out and announced that they were on the opposite side of a single issue in this election, would you still vote for that candidate? And everybody off the top of their head said, of course. It's more than just a one-issue election. You got to look at all the issues. And then they asked them, what if the issue that your candidate changed their opinion on was the issue of abortion? And suddenly the people they were interviewing were speechless. And they thought about it and they said, you know what? If this candidate didn't believe what I believed on that issue, I couldn't in good conscience vote for them. What they determined was that this was such an emotional issue for so many people, 80% of the population, that people were voting without even realizing that this was at the core of why they were voting for the candidate. This was the single most important issue. Which means in this country, we're electing our leaders not based on all the issues, but based on one issue. And I thought, that's crazy. How did this get so out of control that it is the dominant issue of our time? You know, when you have issues like this in society where you have two sides that are just entrenched in their positions, angry at one another, both sides refusing to give, it reminds me of the King Solomon story from the Bible, which I'm sure you've heard. King Solomon was brought a baby by two women. Two women claimed the baby was theirs. Neither would be willing to let go. And so finally, King Solomon made a decision. Does anybody remember what the decision was?
He cut the baby in half.
We'll cut the baby in half. Because since the two of you can't come to agreement, the only fair solution is to give you half the baby and you half the baby. And one woman let go and said, no, I'd rather the baby be whole and be with her than be cut in half. And the baby was awarded to the woman who let go. Well, in society, when we have these types of issues that are so emotional where both sides are just not willing to give an inch, it seems that they would rather see that baby cut in half than ever compromise. So I thought, okay, what if that's ended up what would happen in society? What if we ended up with the worst possible compromise? What would the worst possible compromise in the situation be? So I came up with this idea of a society where, to end a civil war over this issue, the government passed a series of laws that said, from the moment of conception until the age of 13, human life is untouchable. But between 13 and 18, when you have kids who can get wild and out of control, when you can have those things like those violent teenagers in England, during those teenage years, that's when parents can legally have their children terminated and end their lives. And it's just an accepted thing. Society has chosen to accept this as an okay thing. And kids are disappearing from school. You know, you have a fight with your parents, you disappear. You're not doing well in your classes, next day you're gone. Imagine a society where that was just an accepted practice. Here's the problem with that story, though. I couldn't write it. I couldn't write it because I couldn't believe it. I could not believe that we as a society would ever get to the place where we would choose to kill our angry, violent, or unwanted teenagers. And because I can't believe it, I'm not going to write it for you. See, what makes a story like this work is if there's a kernel of truth to it. Just enough truth that it makes you uncomfortable because you could see how this could happen. But since I couldn't believe it ever happening, it was too far-fetched. I mean, it was just pure science fiction. I don't want to write something that's just science fiction for the sake of science fiction. It's got to connect with reality. So it was this idea, I was interested in it, but it didn't have that spark that made me feel like it needed to be told. Until, again, completely unrelated, I saw this article on transplants. Now, I've always been fascinated by medical technology and how it advances. There was a woman in France by the name of Isabelle Denoir, and she had this horrible thing happen to her. Her face was mauled by a dog, to the point that they couldn't repair it. She would have had to have gone through life basically without a face. But they decided to give her radical surgery. They gave her the world's first face transplant. They actually gave her somebody else's face. You could look online and see interviews with her. You can't even tell. It's amazing what they were able to do. The surgeon who performed the surgery made a very bold statement. He said, medical science is advancing so quickly and our ability to do transplants is advancing at such a rapid rate. He predicts that within our lifetimes, they're going to be able to use 100% of a donated body. Imagine that. You donate your body and 100% of you will still be alive, saving hundreds of other people's lives. But that really got me thinking, wait a second. So 100% of you is alive, but does that mean you're dead or are you alive? Are you alive or you're dead if your body is divided up like that? And I thought, well, I guess if you died and then donated your body, there'd be no question about that. But what if you never actually died? Let's just say, hypothetically, they anesthetize you, head to toe, like at the dentist. You can't feel a thing, and then a team of surgeons came in and bit by bit divided you up while you were awake, while you were conscious, and gave different parts of you out to 100 different people. You never actually died. You never lost consciousness, and your body is still alive. So where are you? Where is your soul if your body is divided among 100 people? The question blew me away, not because it's science fiction, but because we might be able to do that in the very near future. But why? Why would we ever put somebody through that process that blurs the whole distinction of life and death? And suddenly I connected it with this other story and I realized that's what they do. They don't kill these unwanted teenagers. They unwind them. They divide them up. So technically, they're not dead, and that's how society rationalizes it. That's how they justify it and say, oh, well, we're really not killing these poor kids. We're just putting them into a divided state. It's better for society, and ultimately it's better for them. And suddenly I could see how we could get to a place where we could condone that, where we could sort of use it as a moral and ethical loophole to allow us to think that it was okay to do that. And it scared me. And it made me think of times throughout history when societies have chosen to do unthinkable things just because they found some moral loophole or because the people around them said it was okay. If your neighbors say it's okay, then it must be okay. I wanted to sort of explore that idea. Now, my goal with Unwind was to take a very neutral position to all of these issues that are of our current day. So Unwind is not pro-life. It's not pro-choice. It's not for or against stem cell research or cloning or any of these controversial issues. Basically, what it's saying is that we have to stop taking sides and drawing a line on the sand on these issues. We have to get it away from the politics, because as long as we take those sides, the only solutions we're ever going to end up with are the ones that cut the baby in half. We need to rise above the politics and look at all of these issues from a different perspective that takes politics away. And Unwind is my attempt to sort of shake up both sides and make everybody look at these things in different ways. And I'm really pleased to say that it's become my most successful book. People get it. You know, it really challenges people to think. At the same time, it gives you this breathless story that hopefully keeps you turning pages. But at the same time, it deals with all of these issues and makes you think about them in a fresh way. And I'm very pleased that it's done so well. And I'm also pleased to say that I've just finished the second book in the Unwind trilogy. And that one is coming out next fall. It's called Unholy, spelled Unwholly. Good question. How many of you have read the book? Okay, so I'm not giving you any spoilers if I talk about this. The character who gets unwound, why did I include that? When I got to that point in the story, I stopped. We were going into the chop shop. We were going to see this process, and I got a little scared. Can I show this? Can I go in there and take the reader through an unwinding? I didn't know. My son, who was 15 at the time, I always have my kids read the books while I'm writing them and get comments back from them. My son read the book up to that point, and I asked him, I'm thinking of not writing an unwind scene. And he looked at me and he said, Dad, you can't. You have to write that scene. You can't deny the reader that scene. The book is called Unwind. It's about this whole process. If you don't show us, you are cheating the reader, and they will not forgive you. And so, I agreed with him, and I realized that I had to do it. So this was the parameters that I set up for myself. 1, I don't want this to be a gross, gory, bloody thing. I'm not about writing gore. What I wanted to do is I wanted to make it a psychological unwinding. You never see what happens. It's all from Roland's point of view. The things that he hears, the things that are going on around him. He feels no pain, but yet he knows what's happening to him until finally bits and pieces of his mind are disappearing. His memories are gone until there's virtually nothing left. And that process, that bloodless process, ended up becoming the unwinding. Also, even if you're not even imagining blood while you're reading it, because what's the first thing that I do? They say that they're replacing his blood with his green oxygenated fluid. So even in your mind, if you were imagining this thing going on, you're not even seeing blood because I've gotten rid of that already. I wanted to make sure that you did not look at this as some bloody, gory scene. It's all about the psychological aspect of what's going on in his mind as he's being taken apart bit by bit. So, and what I found, when I was writing it, I was being very technical and very clinical about it. And the style that I wanted to write it in, I wanted to jump back and forth between the dialogue, what was going on in his mind, what was going on around him, and then make it sort of move faster and faster and faster until there was nothing left, and we were kind of zeroing in on this black hole of his mind until there was nothing left but that I am, and then nothing. And so I was so focused on the structure of it. It wasn't until after people were reading it and came back to me and talked to me about how disturbing it was, did I realize how disturbing it was. But the thing is, more than any other scene, I think that's the scene that makes the book. That's the scene that you remember. And that's the scene that makes the book stick with you. And so, I'm very pleased with the response to it, and I'm very pleased that I wrote it. But it is a very disturbing scene. But it's not bloody and it's not gory. You don't have to write bloody and gory to get something psychologically to affect you. Well, the idea of them running away, I wanted the story to be kind of a fugitive story. I wanted them to be on the run trying to escape from this, from everyone trying to find them. I mean, that's kind of the excitement of the story is their journey to try to escape, and the people that helped them along the way, the people that betrayed them along the way. And within that action story, I wove in all of these social elements to it. So it was a combination of telling a real fast-paced action story, and at the same time telling a story that dealt with sociological issues and weaving it all together. So it was intentional that I made the story as action-packed as possible, so that you could sort of mix that in with all the other stuff and all of the deeper thought. Why did I unwind him? Why did I unwind Roland? It's a good question. When I was first writing the book, when I first outlined the book, I was thinking that I was going to unwind one of our three main characters, either Connor, Risa, or Lev. And I started to think about that, and I realized from a psychological point of view, if I take one of those characters who you care about so deeply, and I unwind them, you're going to put up an emotional barrier. It's going to be so painful, you're going to kind of block it out. So I thought, well, how do I stop that from happening? What if I unwind a character who you hate? A character who you want to get his comeuppance? A character who, when you get to that scene, you say, oh, great, they're unwinding Roland. And then, when you're there, suddenly you start feeling more sympathy than you thought. So it's kind of sneaky, because it's more disturbing that I unwound him because you don't have that emotional barrier in front of you would have had if I unwound one of the main characters. And so it's even that much more affecting because you are not expecting to be as affected by it as you are. So I did that for a very specific reason, and I made him so unlikable for that reason, so that when he was unwound, it would hit you unexpectedly. Why did I have the kids die in the plate on in the crate in the plane? I wanted there, because it added drama and it added mystery to the situation. It sort of was a catalyst for everything that happened after. I mean, it turned Mai into a clapper. It made her angry because her boyfriend was one of the ones who died. And when the Goldens disappeared, everyone started. Connor thought that it was Roland, and so it sort of created this. All the action kind of came off of that. If that didn't happen, a lot of the other stuff that happened afterwards wouldn't have happened. So everything's there for a reason. But that's the reason why I did it, to sort of create a catalyst for all the stuff that was going to happen later. And by catalyst, I mean something that was going to trigger what happened later. Would I be for unwinding? Oh, absolutely not. Like I said, I think it is the worst possible compromise. I think it is a bad decision. And I think that society needs to start looking at these issues in different ways so that we don't end up with unwinding or something like unwinding. Do I fashion the characters after people that I know? Actually, I don't. I do not like characters to be based off of people who I actually know. I want the characters to be their own individuals. Because otherwise, I'm going to be stuck imagining this character as a certain person. That's why when people ask me what actors do I imagine playing roles, I really, when I'm writing the stories, don't want to imagine any actors, because then I'm stuck with the image of that particular actor in my mind. I want the characters to be their own individuals, not modeled after anybody else. Where the characters come from, in Unwind, they started with an idea. I knew that I had to have characters who were going to be going through this unwinding. I decided I wanted, or who were going to be going through this situation, who had unwind orders signed for them. I wanted 3 different kinds of kids. 1, a kid who was at risk, who was always in trouble, whose parents had given up on him. That was Connor. A kid who was a victim of a broken system. That was Risa. She was being unwound because of budget cuts at the orphanage. And 3, a kid who actually wanted to be unwound, and that was Lev. What happens when you take these 3 kids who are being unwound for different reasons and throw them together? So all I started with was the idea of those 3 characters, and as I wrote the first draft, those characters came to life, and they grew. And that's one of the fun things about writing, is those characters start to feel like real people. By the end of the first draft, I had to go back to the beginning and really revise it because those characters' personalities had changed. I knew them better at the end of the book than I did at the beginning. And so I have to do a lot of rewriting to make those characters consistent throughout. Oh, which is my favorite? Well, it's like they say, Mama knows her favorite child, but she ain't going to tell. They're all my favorites. I can't pick a single one. I can say that Unwind is my favorite. I think it's the most socially relevant of all of the books. I think it's my greatest accomplishment. But Everlost is a favorite. I think that's the most creative. The Skinjacker trilogy, Everlost, Everwild, and Everfound, the most creative thing I've ever written. The world that I built for that, I'm very proud of. But then The Schwa Was Here was the most fun to write, hands down. But then Bruiser, I think, is the most heartfelt and most well-crafted of all of the books. They're all favorites. I can't pick one over another. Why did I decide to write a second book after Unwind? I never intended there to be a sequel to Unwind. But I started getting all of these ideas. And they kept me up at night. I was thinking of all of these things. And Unwind was my most popular book. And so I went to my publisher. And I asked them, I was thinking of writing a sequel to Unwind. And they said, sold. So how could I turn that down? It was pretty hard, though. To take your most successful book and write a sequel to it when you never intended to, when it wasn't like Everlost, which was from the beginning, pretty much, I knew it was going to be a trilogy. I had to go back to this world and figure out what was going to happen next. Very complicated and very difficult. I would say Unholy is the hardest book I've ever had to write. And I hope it shows. I hope the effort that went into that shows when the book comes out next year. How did I come up? That's a really good question. You guys, I think, have asked the best questions of the entire week. I just want to let you guys know that. Where did Hayden come up with the questions? Those are the questions I asked myself when I thought of the story. If would you rather die or be unwound? You know, where does your soul go if you're unwound? All of these questions, all the things that Hayden asks, where does life begin? They have that whole question of when does life begin? And I give all the perspectives. You know, life. You know, a soul. Someone gets their soul at conception. Someone else says no. It's when the heart beats. Someone else says no. It's right as you're born. And someone else says no. You don't have a soul until somebody loves you. Everyone has a different point of view, and I don't give any point of view any more weight than another. I just put the ideas out there for people to think about. So the stuff that the characters are thinking about, like Hayden, it's the stuff I'm thinking about when I'm writing the story, and I'm just finding a way to weave it in. Does religion play a role in my writing? Yes, in the sense that I consider myself a spiritual person, but I do not want to put forth any ideas in terms of specific ideology. I want someone of every single religion to be able to read Unwind or Full Tilt or any of the stories and find a way for it to relate to them. You know, even Everlost. In Everlost, I never talk about, you know, they didn't make it to heaven, or these kids who went into the light went to heaven. I never say that. I say they got where they were going. I don't want to negate or deny anything that you might believe. And at the same time, I don't want to push into your mind something that I might believe. I want to try to keep it open and keep it universal so that everybody can relate to it. But there is that sense of spirituality in the stories, but nothing specific, and that's intentional, that it's not specific. How did I come up with the idea of sci-fi? I wanted to show the aftermath of an unwinding. I wanted to show the unintended consequences. You know, a lot of my books, especially Unwind, is about the unintended consequences of the decisions that we make, either individually or as a society. Sci-fi and his whole deal about having to get home and not even realizing what was driving him there until he digs up that stuff and shows it, I felt was sort of, I mean, he's a tragic character. Or more tragic is the kid whose part of his brain is inside him. And that moment that Lev realizes that this kid inside of Lev, who Lev just has a small part of his mind, that kid doesn't even realize he's already been unwound. That's the moment when Lev really snaps, when he really sees the full consequence of unwinding. So that's why I had sci-fi. I mean, I really wanted to show you, through Lev, seeing the horror of this situation. What made me think to write these books? Speaking generally, I would say what makes me write the books is there's three things that will propel me into writing a book. You know, I tend to have more ideas than I have time to write. And that really comes from, I mean, that's not a hard thing to have happen. If it takes me 6 to 9 months to write a book, I'm going to have lots of ideas during that time. If I only have one idea a month, at the end of 6 months when I'm done with a book, I'm going to have 6 new ideas, and that's only one idea a month. I can't write them all. So the ones that get my attention have 3 things going for them. One, they're original. I like writing stories that are like nothing I've ever seen before. So you'll probably never catch me writing a vampire romance, or a story about dragons. It's already been done. I don't want to repeat what's already been done. But if I come up with a concept that I've never seen, regardless of the genre, I get excited about it. 2, it's got to be universal. And by universal, I mean that regardless of your culture, regardless of who you are, there is something about this story that you can relate to personally, that everybody can connect to. Stories that 10, 20, 30 years from now, people will still feel are as relevant. I was at a school this week. The entire school read The Shadow Club. And they were talking about how it felt like it could be happening today. It could be happening in their class. Shadow Club was my first book I wrote 25 years ago. And to know that today, 25 years later, there is nothing that dates that book and still people can feel as if it is relevant, that's what I want to do. I want to write books that will outlast me, that will still be relevant many, many years from now. So stories that are universal. But 3, the most important thing, stories got to be screaming to be told. That I can't predict. I have no idea what is going to make a story scream to be told. But sometimes there are stories that are just knocking at the back of my mind saying, Neil, you have to write me. I'm the important one. I'm the one that you have to put out there. You have to drop everything else and write this. And when I get that feeling, don't know why, don't know where it comes from, when I get that feeling, those are the books that I write. Because I know that the passion that I have when I'm writing gets into the pages. People will ask me, is writing boring? Writing's only boring if you're writing something you're not passionate about. But if you care so deeply about what you're writing about, that passion that you have will get right in there in the pages, and it will go to the person who's reading it as well. What happens when I get stuck when I'm writing? It happens all the time. You know, before I start writing, I trick myself. And I know that it's a trick, but I do it anyway. The trick is I plot out the book beginning to end so that I think I know exactly where it's going. And when I've convinced myself I know everything that's going to happen in this book, then I start writing. And in every single book, there comes a point at which the characters who have minds of their own want to do something other than what I expected they would do. Well, I'm not going to force the character into a direction that doesn't feel right for them. If the story starts going into a different direction, I got to drop what I did before and reevaluate and then replot the story out in that new direction. And so I have to figure out where the story is going to go from there. And sometimes I get stuck. I can't figure out where the story is going to go now. Usually it ends up coming to the same basic place that I imagined. It's the path of getting there that becomes very different in the process. And so many times I do get stuck like that, and it's just I'm just pounding it out. When I was working on Unholy, the book came out to be about 420 pages long, which is about the same length as Ever Wild, I think was that length. I mean, Ever Found was, I think, 500 pages. My books seem to be getting longer. But when I was writing Unholy, I took out a lot of material that didn't work. False leads that suddenly felt like I had to just cut it and go back. I ended up with about 80 pages of material that didn't end up in the book because the story took a different direction. So, sometimes you got to do that. You just got to, it's like pruning a tree. This branch is growing out in a direction you don't want it. Cut it off and train it in a different direction. Lev had to come into his own. He had to become a leader. He had to have someone to help rather than being the one who was always being dragged along. And I figured the only way to let that happen is to put him out on his own, so he had to fend for himself and learn the hard way. And so he was out on his own, away from Connor and Risa. He got a little bit street smart, and then he ended up stuck with Sci-Fi, who he ended up being the one taking care of Sci-Fi rather than the other way around. And so it really built his character. So I felt he needed to be away from Connor and Risa for that to happen. The hardest thing about writing is finding a story worth telling. Coming up with that idea that is screaming you to be told, that is just worth putting out there. I have lots of ideas that are kind of fun stories. If I have a fun story that doesn't really seem to have any real reason for being told, but I just want to have fun with it, I'll write a short story. I won't write that into a book. But for writing the books, that story, there's got to be something about it that just makes it feel important enough for me to write a book. And that's the hard part, is finding those ideas. I would say I'm in all the characters. When you're a writer, you're not writing from the outside in. You're writing from the inside out. I mean, you have to become those characters when you write about them. You have to see the world through those characters' eyes as much as you can. Writing is like being an actor. You got to be the character. You can't help but put yourself into all of those characters. So I can't say any one is me more than any other. I always tell people, you want to know who I am? Read my books, because I'm in all of those characters. Why did the bull have to die, and why did he have this bull? Well, it could have been a dog, but that would have been uninteresting. We've seen that before. I wanted to make it a little bit absurd and weird and funny at the same time that it was sad. And I wanted it to be different. The reason why it was a bull, other than anything else, is because in my neighborhood where I live in this community in Southern California where we have all of these, it's these subdivisions and suburban community, but there is this one farmhouse that refused to sell. And so it is surrounded by a strip mall on the side with a supermarket and houses on the other side in the middle of this busy street, and there's this farm right in the middle of all of it with a bull. And it was just always this bizarre thing. And you drive by it every day. You see, there's the supermarket, the pharmacy, a school, a bull, houses. It just was so absurd and bizarre. And so that's what I was thinking of when I put that. I says, what if Bruiser lived in that farmhouse with the bull in the middle of all of these suburban homes? And so that's where that came from. It came a little bit of reality. The hardest character to write about in Unwind was Lev. Lev was the character who had the biggest journey to make, from being an absolute innocent to being a terrorist. The journey of that character I found the most interesting. The more complicated a character is and the greater their character arc, the more interesting it is for me as a writer, but challenging. I had to really explore what this poor kid is going through. How does he get to that place where he is so angry and so unable to deal with the changes in his life that he is able to be brought into this terrorist group, that he is so much a victim of because they were able to pull him in and draw him into that. So he was the hardest character to write, but in the book he's my favorite character. And the fact that he chooses not to clap, the fact that ultimately, in the end, he fights against that and makes the right decision. I mean, that's the moment of his real growth, when he realizes, I can't do this. It was a different thing than you were expecting. That's why I did it. When I was first conceiving of Unwind, I was imagining all the different things that could happen. And there's all of these different possibilities when you're conceiving of a story. And you don't use everything. But I thought of this idea of what if in the story there was parents who went nuts and were trying to gather the parts of their kid and wind them back together. And just taking these parts back and putting their kid back together. And I thought, well, that's creepy and gross. And it's kind of like a campfire story. I said, okay, this is going to be like this urban legend, this campfire story that they tell in the basement to scare themselves. And I said, well, what is this kid going to be called? And I thought of the whole idea, well, they're trying to put him back together again. It's kind of like Humpty Dumpty. Okay, is there a name that I could come up with that sounds like Humpty Dumpty? And I came up with Humphrey Dunphy. And so I came up with that, and it was just going to be just this urban legend that really didn't have anything to do with the story, until I realized, what if I twisted that on its ear? This is something that you think is something that's horrible and creepy. What if it ended up being something beautiful? What if we find out that it's the admiral who's doing this, and we think it's horrible, but when we see what he's really doing, the gathering of all the people together, so that in some sense his son can be back together, and it's not this gross, gory thing, but just having them all in the same room and having that sense that maybe, just maybe, his son's spirit is there with them. The idea of taking something that you thought was going to be horrific and turning it into something beautiful is why I did it. I wanted to take that expectation and turn it around by making them real. The characters, one of the main things that I learned as a writer as time went on is that the characters have to be real people. They can't do things just because you want them to do it. They've got to do things because they want to do it. And if you want this character to turn right, but that character, that character is going to turn left, then you can't make them turn right unless they want to do it. So by being true to who those people are, those characters are, it makes them seem more real. And also giving them attributes of their things that they think about and the way they make decisions that connects them with the reader, so that people can say, yeah, if I was that character, if I was her, I would do that. Or if I was him, that's how I would react. Or it might even be the other thing. Looking at the character and saying, oh no, I know this character isn't thinking right and they're going to do this wrong thing and I don't want them to do it, but I know why they're making that decision. I wish I could be in there with the book with them to point out that they're making the wrong decision. You know why they're making it. You might not agree with it, but you know why. Even the bad characters. You look at Mary in Everlost. You don't like her. How many of you have read Everlost, by the way? Okay, not as many of you, but she's a character who's kind of a little bit scary. Actually, a lot scary. But at the same time, you understand why she's doing what she's doing, and you understand who she is. So even though you don't agree with her, you get her. And that's really important for the characters and stories. You got to get them, even if you don't like them. Why did I want to become a writer? Sometimes people ask me, why did you choose writing? I feel like writing chose me. It's just something that is a part of who I am. I don't know what I would do if I didn't write. I'm very lucky that I'm able to make my career doing what I would do anyway if they didn't pay me. Of course, don't tell my publishers I would do it even if they didn't pay me. But it's just something that I love to do. The idea of taking something that is only up here and putting it out there into the world and having other people be able to read your mind, it's an amazing thing. And I consider myself blessed to be able to do that. Why didn't he run away right away? I think maybe because he was holding out the thought that maybe his parents might change their mind. At a certain point, he realized, this is going down. I got to get out of here. Do I hope that one of my books becomes a movie? I hope that all my books become movies. Which one would I like to become a movie? I would love to see Unwind as a movie done right. Well, I'd like them all done right. But Unwind is, of all the books, I think Unwind is the one that has the most potential for being done wrong. So I really want Unwind done right. And I'm actually in the process of working on a script, and there's producers who are involved, and looks like it's moving closer to getting made. No guarantee yet, but keep your fingers crossed on that. But I would love to see all the books made into movies. The entertainment industry, though, they chew through material so quickly, and they don't make everything that they develop. The average is of every script that is written and paid for by the studios, only 1 out of every 30 will actually get made into a movie. So you ever wonder why some of your favorite books have not been made into movies? That's why. Now, certain ones will get made. I mean, you knew that Harry Potter was going to get made into a movie. They were so wildly popular. Same thing with Twilight. If something is wildly successful, that's going to guarantee a movie gets made. But for everything else that isn't of the level of Harry Potter or Twilight in terms of popularity, 1 in 30. I would consider Lev a troubled protagonist. That's a good question. I consider him a protagonist who makes some bad choices. But ultimately, he makes a hero's journey because he comes out at the end as the hero. I mean, Connor is a hero, but Lev is also, because Lev is the one who saves Connor. Do I have any life experiences that inspire my books? I think everything that you've experienced in your life goes into what you think about and goes into what you write about. So there's little aspects of things that have happened to me, specific things that I'll put into the stories. But mostly it's just the combination of my life experience that goes into the books. Why did I have a teacher help Connor and Risa? Because I think in a world where people are making a lot of bad decisions and everybody's going along with the bad decisions, I wanted to show that a teacher was going to be the one to help them. That was a surprise. I was writing that scene when Connor woke up, and suddenly, I'm imagining the scene, and suddenly Connor looks at his arm and there's a shark on it. And it's like I pushed back from the computer, I go, whoa. And I had to sort of process that. So it was a total surprise for me. But then I thought, oh, how ironic and perfect. And so once I realized that, I had to have it happen. But it wasn't something I planned. I don't want to take a position on that because it's a question. The whole idea of blurring the line of life and death, at the end, when all of those people come back and all of the parts of Harlan Dunphy are there, and it's almost as if he is there. Is he? I think that the Admiral believes that he is. Do I believe that he is? I don't know. You got to think about that yourself. It's a gray area. I suppose Ariana goes on through high school and meets somebody else, or I was thinking of actually having somebody show up with her eyes to imply that sometime later she herself got unwound. But I never found a really good place to put that, and I didn't know whether I wanted to draw attention back to that. I wanted to kind of show Connor's old life is through. He can't go back to that. And she represents everything from his old life. He has a new path now. So I just chose not to bring her back. It continues the story, but it poses new questions, different questions about decisions that society makes and how society and how the forces who want unwinding, the corporations who are making a lot of money from it and things like that, how they are fighting to keep the public believing that unwinding is a good thing. How they put all of these ads talking about how it's actually the humane thing to do. And so we start to realize that there are forces that are trying to perpetuate this and convince people that it's okay. And the question is, why are people so easily convinced? and then we find out a little bit more of the history of what happened before and during the war that made people accept this. How did I come up with the rise in Full Tilt? In Full Tilt, it's a story about sort of the psychological amusement park where every single ride is kind of like a metaphor for your own personal worst fears. So I made a list of rides, and then I made a list of personal issues that people have. And I just sort of started to draw lines between them and see which ones kind of came together. Like, for instance, main character, he's graduated from high school early, he's going to be going off to college, he's terrified. And so I thought, what if I have this carousel, and every single animal on the carousel is a college mascot. And when he gets on the carousel, it starts going around, and suddenly the poles disappear, the animals come to life, and he's riding the back of a blue lion, which is the mascot for Columbia University, which is where he's going to be going, and he's in a stampede of all of these snarling, stampeding college mascots, and kids are falling off of their animals, getting trampled, getting eaten, and he has to survive. So it's kind of like if you take, it's kind of like dream psychology. When there's something that's bugging you in a dream, it transforms into something else, and it becomes, a metaphor for what's bothering you. That's what I wanted to do with the rides in Full Tilt. The rides are a metaphor for the real fears and issues the character has. Why would I have Risa and Connor take the stork baby? 2 reasons. One, it creates an obstacle for them and makes it harder for them to escape. 2, it's a really important character moment for Connor. Why he took the baby? Up to that point in the story, Connor was not a particularly sympathetic character. He hadn't done anything to really put himself out there. I mean, sure, he did rescue Lev, but he was using Lev as a human shield, so that wasn't entirely honorable either. I wanted him to do something that really put himself at risk, but he felt compelled to do because he was a good person. And that was one of the things that, even though Risa thought this was the stupidest thing he could have done, it kind of bonded them together, because the fact that this guy who's running for his life would save a baby says a lot about his character and who he is. Why did I come up with storking and clappers? Storking is one of the unintended consequences of unwinding, or of the Unwind Accord, which made this society, the rules of this society. One of the things that I really wanted to deal with in the story were the unexpected consequences of decisions that we make as a society. And I will give you an example of that in real life. There is basically storking in Nebraska. It's called the Safe Haven Law. Most states have a safe haven law. And the reason why they pass these laws is because they don't want mothers who don't want their babies, newborn babies, they don't want these babies to suffer horrible fates. And so what they do is there's a law in almost every state that says if you have a newborn baby and you don't want it, you can bring it to a police station or a fire station. And you can leave the baby there and wash your hands of it, no questions asked, and that baby becomes a ward of the state. And that way, someone who's desperate, a woman who doesn't want that baby, you don't end up with babies that are found, in dumpsters and things like that. At least they can do something with that baby, and that baby will be alive. Here's the problem with that law, though. In Nebraska, they were going to pass the law, but nobody could agree what the legal age should be. Should it be just a newborn? Should the baby be younger than 6 months? And so they passed the law without an age limit. And then people started leaving unwanted teenagers at police stations and hospitals and fire stations. People started driving across state lines to drop off the teenagers that they couldn't handle anymore and leave them in Nebraska. It became a huge problem. And this is just 2 years ago. So, you talk about Unwind as fiction. Look at some of the stuff that really happens. We always have to be vigilant about making sure that we don't set up laws that have unintended consequences, and that as a society, we don't start going in a direction where we condone activities that we really shouldn't. The spinning teacup in Full Tilt. The school bus that spun out of control and went over a cliff. I thought, how could I represent that in a ride? And then I sort of imagined a spinning teacup ride with a single teacup spinning on a black, icy turntable, and the color of the teacup was school bus yellow. And from the moment that you saw that teacup in the story, you knew once he got into it, it was going to turn into that bus accident that we've been talking about through the whole story. And he's going to have to relive that accident that changed his life. Tips for writers. 4 things. 1, you have to write. That might seem obvious, but I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, I want to be a writer, I have all of these ideas, and I ask them, oh, well, what have you written? Well, I haven't written anything, but I have all these ideas, I just can't put them down. Well, if you don't put them down, you're not a writer. The trick of writing is getting it out from your head and onto the page. You have to do it once, you have to do it twice, you got to keep on doing it. The more you write, the better you get. 2, rewrite. Rewriting is the single most important part of the writing process. Everything that I write goes through 6 major drafts before I even get to a place where I put that stamp on it that says first draft. 6 drafts before I get to a first draft, and then 3 or 4 drafts after that. Rewriting is the most important part. 3, you got to be a reader. If you want to be a writer, you have to read. And not just one kind of thing. You have to read every single genre, every style of writing. You have to really learn your craft by reading what else is out there and what other authors are doing. And 4, you have to persevere. You have to be persistent. You will not win every contest you submit your story to. You will not get the results you want from everything that you write, and more than likely, your stories will get rejected more often than they are accepted. For me, my first 2 books were never published. There's a good reason for that. They were terrible. I had to write the first one, though, to be a good enough writer to write the second. I had to write the second to be a good enough writer to write the third, which was The Shadow Club, my first published book. If I stopped anywhere along the way, I wouldn't be an author, and I would have never have learned the craft of being an author. But I was persistent, and I kept at it, and I got better. And to this day, I still think that my goal as a writer is to keep getting better with everything that I write. I'm always trying to do that. So write, rewrite, read, and persevere. You guys have been a great way to end my visit to Nebraska. You have made that's the best questions of the week. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you. Now, I want to let you guys know that if you want to keep up with what's happening in the books and maybe even read excerpts from upcoming books, visit me on my website, which is storyman.com. Or even better, sign up to like my Facebook fan page, which is easy to find. That's just Neil Shusterman. Not my personal page, but the fan page. On the fan page is where I do a lot of free giveaways. I give away autographed books and autographed posters. I even name characters after my Facebook fans. So I hope to see you there. Thank you very much.